make men holy. Let us die to make men free. While God is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. The highest praise is glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on.
African American culture during the 1930s and 40s endured tremendous peaks and valleys. From the Harlem Renaissance through the Great Depression to World War II, each event brought new triumphs and tragedies to the African American people. One organization stood as the foundation for the people of color during this time to build upon. That organization was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, known as the N.A.A.C.P.
In the N.A.A.C.P. is the old man of the movement, W.E.B. Du Bois. I mean, Du Bois was the face of the N.A.A.C.P. in its early years. He was the only black official there. He was editor as well as publisher in the sense of Crisis. African Americans knew of the N.A.A.C.P. through Crisis. The Crisis was Du Bois, and Du Bois was the Crisis. Well, by the mid 1930s, Du Bois is starting a journey that is moving him more and more to the left. I mean, he is quite impressed by the Bolshevik revolution in Russia. He sees the appeal of what you would call a democratization of the means of production. That, in a sense, saying is that a critique of wealth accumulation in the hands of just a few, and the possibilities of having, as one of his terms was, enlightened entrepreneurship. So he's moving more and more to the left, and so I believe it's in 1934, in the late spring, early summer, he starts writing a series of editorials, commentary in the Crisis about this thing called a nation within a nation. And what he's advocating is that African Americans, and this in a sense is quite profound for Du Bois to say that, saying that, look, African Americans will never get equal rights in the United States as is. So what they need to do is self-segregate, hold themselves back, build up their institutions, financial, social, political, and then deal with white America like a nation versus a nation. Well, for an official of the N.A.A.C.P. to say this, an official of the N.A.A.C.P., the organization that, whether you want to use the word integration or the term that I use, access, an organization that has always advocated access, the lid just goes on. And there are these wonderful forums that are going back and forth about this debate. Some people are arguing that Du Bois has lost his mind. So isn't that the same thing that Booker T. Washington said, to pull yourself back? And he's writing back. And remember, at this time, 1934, Du Bois is 69 years old. So he's not a young man, but he still has another, 26 years or so of productivity out there. So he's commenting on what's going on here, and he's saying, no, it's really in the South, dealing with a nation as a period in sense of strength. And then Walter White now, who blonde, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, but is a black man. Walter White, who is the face, the sort of gregarious face of the N.A.A.C.P., the man who is the tireless lobbyist, who is the backslapper, the person who knows everybody, who does all the lobbying, who is personal friends with Eleanor Roosevelt, who arranges a meeting with Franklin Roosevelt. He is also appalled, and he comes out with an official position saying, no, this is not the official position of the N.A.A.C.P. And then Du Bois fires back saying that, well, Walter White doesn't see all this problem because he, in essence, is a white man. And I mean, oh, and then I guess that's why I just sound so excited, because can you imagine someone saying that in Sensei today? Because there would all be all these commentators out there saying that what's happening, the new neoconservatives, people would start putting labels on it. No, there's no labels to begin with it. The real thing is here is that they all have the same goal, but yet the strategies are different. So this eventually comes to a head that eventually leads to Du Bois resigning from the N.A.A.C.P. or being forced out, depending on what you have to see it. So, and the other irony about this is that as Du Bois is criticizing the N.A.A.C.P., he is being criticized by the Young Turks for still, despite the fact that Du Bois is to the left of the N.A.A.C.P., he's still seeing things through this prism of race. So it's this notion about each generation devours its predecessors, and they're just devouring him. The grand man of letters, this man who has been the face of the struggle for, and as we'll see, through the 20th century. They just, in a sense, devour him. So
there are some tremendously unfortunate conflicts, to be sure, particularly between Marcus Garvey, W.B. Du Bois, A. Philip Randolph, the great labor leader of the period as well, who was one of the founders of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, one of the first serious union efforts to bring black workers together, to unionize them, particularly in the railroad industry. And Randolph, in those early years, he's much more socialist. So, you have all these different isms, so socialism, Pan-Africanism, nationalism, integrationism, hitting against one another. But you then find it, too, at times moving on a very destructive personal level. It's very sad that some of the comments that you would find going back and forth from Garvey about Du Bois about Garvey, each other about Randolph and etc. And they would play these things out in their official publications of their organizations. Marcus Garvey, who was the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which embodied his philosophy in the Back to Africa movement, etc. And his major publication, which was the Black World, this newspaper that his organization put out. And in the pages of the Black World, of course, he would lash out at leaders who he thought were leading the race along the wrong lines, such as W.B. Du Bois. And he talks about Du Bois as a quadroon, as a mulatto, and you find these kinds of personal attacks that Du Bois can't decide which way to go, his white side or his black side, because Du Bois was I guess we would, in fact, define him as a mulatto. Of course, society defined him point blank as a black person. No question about that. And then you'd find Du Bois firing back in the pages of Crisis magazine. Crisis was the official publication of the N.A.A.C.P. And Du Bois, one of the founders of the N.A.A.C.P. and the founder of Crisis magazine, firing back at Garvey, and some very unfortunate things. He actually calls Garvey fat, black, and ugly. And you find that kind of thing going on. And then here's Randolph in the mix, who's upset with Du Bois, because Du Bois, as the period goes on and the issue of World War I, Du Bois comes out in 1919 with a famous article called Closed Ranks. And in that article, Du Bois advocates that black folk support the World War I effort. And Randolph, who's much more of a socialist, he's outraged by this. In fact, he fires in his publication, which was The Messenger, the publication of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. He fires back in his publication saying, Du Bois, I thought one of the leaders with sense, and he clearly doesn't have any, and so they were battling back. Meanwhile, there's Garvey, who, in between Garvey and Randolph, you have just a bitter clash in terms of their goals, their leadership style. And in 1923, A. Philip Randolph, in the pages of the Messengers, declares he's going to do a systematic study of Garveyism, and to conclude why Garveyism is wrong and wrong-headed. And he thought all this stuff about going back to Africa was ridiculous, and that black folks were going to stay here and they better figure out how best to work here. And Randolph, of course, thought the way you do that, one of the keys was for blacks to organize in unions. And Garvey opposed that because he thought the idea of blacks and whites joining hands in unions was ridiculous. You know, black folks, black only, go back to Africa, etc. And so in Randolph's Messenger, you have a sad kind of attack on Garveyism. In fact, Randolph, this so-called scientific study ended up being a piece that's one of the most heated pieces I think ever published. And in it he calls Marcus Garvey a supreme Negro jackass from Jamaica, and says he has a diseased brain, etc., and is going to lead the race in the wrong direction. The reality, when you look at this aspect of it, you say, how sad. But you back up for a minute and not just focus on the negatives. What you see are determined individuals who are fighting for the leadership of the race. What all of them have in common is that they all want the race to advance. Now, it would have been nice if they could have avoided all this and come together as a group and said, how can we work together to advance the race? But that was not possible. And so you have strong egos, different organizations, much of it, of course, centered there in New York and Harlem, which is the black mecca of the era, and they're fighting for the salvation of the race. So they're passionate leaders, and I think when we look at them, and we can look at their differences, I think one of the things to keep in mind is that why it would become so heated is because they see so much at stake. They're fighting for the hearts, the souls, the minds, and the survival of African American people. And when you're doing that, unfortunately, sometimes you can become, shall we say, hostile to certain individuals, rather than finding a way for those individuals to work together. So that period of the early 20th century is a tremendously active period where black folks are getting in print, where you have this kind of leadership element to the forefront, even with the death of Washington in 1915. Still, I think you can see that it's a period where black folks are trying to articulate, and their leadership to articulate, where do we go? What is the best way for us to proceed in order to advance as a people? Is it we give up on America and go back to Africa? Is it we struggle, as Randolph liked to say, from within and make the system work? Or it's a Du Bois says, I mean, do we form all these different organizations like the N.A.A.C.P and try and get change to make the system fairer? The reality is all of these individuals wanted the race to advance.
So you get this debate here, and the N.A.A.C.P is just highly sensitive of it, and that's one of the reasons why the N.A.A.C.P, as part of the activist sentiment in the 1930s, initiates the passage for the Costigan-Wagner anti-lynching bill that tried in the 1920s with the Dyer bill, and it was unsuccessful. This is what spurs this is one of the things that spurs the N.A.A.C.P. That and the fact that there is a rise in lynching again after a couple of years of decline. It starts to peak up again in the early 1930s, and one of the more horrendous ones was the Claude Neal lynching in Florida, where this young man was accused of killing a white man's daughter, and the mob went in and broke into the sheriff's jail, and they advertised this, that he was going to be lynched, and he was mutilated and forced to eat his genitals, and advertisements were all around here. So that shocked in the sensitive nation. So the NAACP actually didn't use that as its impetus. They actually used, again, typical NAACP strategy, they actually used the lynching of two white men in San Jose, California, to say that this was the opening salvo in our efforts to once again get a federal anti-lynching law, but the lynching of Claude Neal was, the pamphlets were made, disseminated out, were sent to various organizations in order to elicit their aid. So it was a very ecumenical effort, particularly in the sense of among, or especially among religious organizations. The lynching of Claude Neal, which was actually investigated by a white socialist by the name of Harry Mitchell, who's important as the founder of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. This pamphlet is also sent out to various celebrities in order to use this in sense as a fundraiser. And what's interesting about their efforts, now the bill has never passed. I mean, to date, there is no anti-lynching bill, and whenever you see things that happen when local jurisdictions don't have it, it always goes in as a violation of one's civil rights. So there was never an anti-lynching bill, but it passed Congress both times, and I believe it was 2 times, and it may even be 3, but I know definitely since 2, but each time in the Senate it is filibustered. And again, showing Franklin Delano Roosevelt, while gives kind of lip public service to it, never does anything behind the scenes to do this, because in 1937, the depression that the nation thought was getting itself out of kicks it back in again, because one of the things that Roosevelt does in the second election after 1936 is that he decides that he wants to now balance the budget and cut back on these social programs. So it kicks in an even more devastating sort of back reverberation with regard to the depression, and in fact they call the second one Roosevelt's depression. And so he's concerned about that, of getting the nation out of it. And then I think the second time that it makes his passage, it's clear that war clouds are on the horizon, at least for America's involvement in World War II. So he again steps aside for it, gives a sort of like lip service, but never does anything behind the scene to take care of it. But the other aspect about the Wagner bill is that what you see the N.A.A.C.P does, the strategy, reaching out to moderate to liberal legislators of both parties in Congress, sending information about lynching and the horrors of lynching to moderate Southern white newspaper editors, fundraising activities, exhibits, and live. It's the exact same tactics that the organization will use in the post-World War II phase of the civil rights movement. And one of the things that as historians should not do, but we still do sometimes for simplicity, is that we like periodization. We like to talk about the 10s, the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, and we act as if like, particularly when you're dealing with the people of color in this country, that this ongoing struggle for empowerment is periodized. That is, that it begins in the 20s, and then the 30s in a sense is something different, and then the 40s is something different. Well, there is a kind of continuity in that struggle, and that while what was adequate in terms of perceptions and questions asked in the 1930s are certainly not adequate in terms of perceptions asked and questions asked in the 1960s, it's still ongoing. And so they learn. So what they learned from the 1930s in this Costa Wagner, you can see that what happens in the 1960s. The other aspect in the sense that when you think about this, but there is also a common thread that still runs through a lot of this, particularly through the non-secular community of leadership, is the role of the African-American Jeremiah. And it is particularly prominent in the 1960s, but it is not exclusive to the 1960s, because you see this during the colonial period of this country, you see this during the early period of the American Revolution. In fact, my students were reading documents that come from a book called Race and Revolution, which is quite good. And the Jeremiah, in a sense, it comes from Jeremiah, from the Old Testament, and Jeremiah, the prophet, is lamenting the fact that Jews had broken the covenant brought down by Moses. But the Jeremiah has 3 generic components that are uniquely, in a sense, American. That America is more than just a physical entity. It is a place blessed by God. And the roots of this go back to the 1630s, when John Winthrop is giving a sermon among the Arab, along the Arabella, his famous City Upon a Hill sermon. America it has the blessings in the sense of God, and we have to live up to those blessings. Now, of course, you can fast forward and see how arrogant that can, in a sense, there be, and what impact that has had in American history. But then there's also the notion that one has to critique what has happened to that blessing. That if you veered off course, you have to wonder what has happened to you. Why have you veered off course? That's why so much of our discussion during the revolutionary period in history pertained to slavery. Slavery was always part of our discourse. It has been airbrushed out of history, but these founding fathers were indeed talking about slavery, not so much concerned about the impact slavery was having on black, but what it was having to this notion about American benevolence and being blessed by God. But then there's always the hope that we will veer back to the promise of the nation. The African-American Jeremiah takes the exact same pathway, but with one major difference. If America is a chosen nation, African Americans, because they have been seared by their suffering, are the chosen among the chosen. And as a part of that, there's that critique of what has happened to a nation that is the chosen among the chosen, and what has happened by those people who are chosen among the chosen, and how do we bring them back? You see this constantly in the post-World War II period of the Civil Rights Movement, and perhaps the most glaring example of the Jeremiah is Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech, that where you critique the promise. It's opening about, in the fourscore years ago, in whose symbolic shadow we stand here, a great American, the great emancipator. But then he critiques the promise. Look how we veered away from that promise. The epiphanies of 100 years later. 100 years later, the nation still has a blank check to Negro America. But then how do we veer back into that promise that African Americans will show the way? And how does he end on that? All God's children, white men and black men, Jews and Gentile, Protestant and Catholic. But what do they sing? They don't sing any song. They sing the words of the old Negro spiritual. You see? The chosen among the chosen. Now, King, that very complicated man, while he never veers away necessarily from the notion of the Jeremiah as a protest thought, however, by the end of his life, also in a sense they realize, does a more stinging critique of why we have steered away from that. A critique that takes on gender, a critique that takes on class. Even black nationalists in the 1960s are also using a form of the Jeremiah. They too, despite the sneer, despite the look, despite what we would traditionally call the black nationalists, the afros and the berets and the dark glasses, they are still doing that same form of protest thought through the Jeremiah, but with one major difference, that in King and the generic African American Jeremiah, this is African Americans will lead the way, but we will do this with our white brothers and sisters. In the black nationalist Jeremiah, whites are not part of that equation because you had your chance and you've blown it. And so we have to do it on our way. So on the last note, so when I think it was Floyd McKissick, when he makes the comment, well, Floyd McKissick of CORE, when he makes the comment that seems somewhat, heretical to say this, but he's actually still embracing the Jeremiah. He says that, what we should do with Lady Liberty is break her legs and point her to Mississippi. He's still embracing the notion of the Jeremiah by saying, look at the critique, look at the uniqueness of America, but look what has happened to that uniqueness, and it's now a farce. And so now we have to bring ourselves back, and you, white America, are outside of that domain.
Have seen the glory of sentence